Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome back to the Grow Podcast. This is episode 31. I'm so glad that you're here with us. My name is David, and as always, I'm here with Pastor Mike. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello.
Episode 31. Do you have any exciting comments about the number?
As you were talking, I was trying to come up with something unique, and I've got nothing today other than, we're no longer young adults because once you pass 30.
We did talk about that last time.
Did we?
I'm kind of sad we didn't. Steph Curry, my favorite basketball player of all time, wears the number 30.
Oh.
And we could have talked about that last week, but I failed to do so. So I apologize to everybody. I'm sure you would have loved to hear me talk about Steph Curry for about 15 minutes at the open of the podcast.
That would have
one
been
of these weeks,
growth-oriented.
One of these weeks we should do like a deep dive into my favorite athletes of all time. I feel like that's the most important next step for everybody here on the Grow Podcast.
Not going to happen.
And then we'll play a game, and it'll be, can Pastor Mike tell us what sport this athlete played?
And I would lose every bit of it. It's funny you say that because I was just writing a teaching for an event we have coming up, and my opening line is, I know nothing about sports. Oh. So, yeah. It's
the Vikings will do nothing but hurt you.
But see, everybody knows that.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair.
Like common knowledge. So
maybe part of the reason why you're such a good teacher is you spend time writing teachings and studying instead of deep diving into Steph Curry's sophomore year of college
dealing
stats.
With the disappointment of my team not winning.
Well, speaking of which, let's kind of get into what we're going to talk about this week. We just wrapped up our last series on our Sunday services.
Yep.
Best year yet.
Yep. Not
best year ever.
Nope.
And it was the last altar of Abraham we hit on, but it was a really cool series. I think I said on the podcast, but I know I told you when you just said what the name of the series was going to be, I was like, I have no idea. Like it just sounded kind of like a throwaway series. Like, all right, we just did.
Yes, because that's what we do around here, a throwaway series.
But we just did our big Christmas series, and Easter's coming in a few months. But all right, we'll just do let's
fit something in.
Best year yet. Let's just talk about New Year's resolutions or something. But it obviously was not that, and it's been such a great series. I really enjoyed it. It's been really impactful for me, and I know for a lot of those that are joining us here too. But so why don't you give us a quick review of the first four altars? We've been going through the altars of Abraham, and then let us know. Hopefully you've been joining us on the weekends. If you haven't, make sure you go check out those episodes. If you're with us on YouTube, you can find all of them, all of those services here on our YouTube channel or on our website, New Hope Here. But if you missed any of Pastor Mike's Sunday teachings, make sure you check those out because the Grow Podcast has definitely been supplementing those. But run us through those.
So we talked about the altars of Abraham. In case you want to check it out, you'll find them from Genesis 12 through about Genesis 36. So you can go read about them. And there's 5 of them, that 5 altars that Abraham wrote. So the altar of promise, the altar of intimacy, the altar of no return, the altar of possession, and the altar of faith. So, and we put a big idea with each one of these,
right? Kind
of a big learning. And like we talked about last week, they really reflect some of the progression of how God grows us, which is a real tie into the Grow Podcast. But like the altar of promise, one of the first things we learn about God is I cannot experience the promises of God, easy for me to say, promises of God in my life if I disobey his direction for my life. From there, we deal with relationship, the altar of intimacy, that God created relationships to take time. Then we talked about the altar of no return, or better, I think is better, the altar of surrender. I cannot move forward with God if I'm looking in the wrong direction. In other words, if I'm looking to the wrong source for my life. The altar of possession, which is fun because we talked about tithing, which is always a controversial thing, and we kind of went into it a little bit deeper last week on the Grow Podcast. My stewardship affects my relationship. And then the final one, the altar of faith. When I want to give up, because there will always be times we want to give up, go big with God instead. It's kind of, and it sounds like almost a locker room talk, but we really have a choice at that point in time. God is, I think, will allow us to be in situations where it's like, okay, I want to give up. And we can give up, or we can step into a new arena of faith.
and just a quick reminder, the altar of possession was not about demon possession. One day we'll do my demon possession podcast where I just riddle you with possession questions.
Yeah, it was actually about tithing.
It was,
yeah.
Really good podcast, by the way. Definitely, if you missed last week, I enjoyed that one a lot. Talking about a topic that's not always people's favorite thing for the church to talk about.
And it's so interesting because, and we didn't actually talk. Did we touch on that in the podcast? Bible talks about money more than any other subject. I haven't personally researched that, but multiple scholars have checked that out.
I think you should personally go verse by verse and count every topic.
Yeah. Verse by
Don't
verse
trust
as
other
we go
people's
through that.
study.
But what's so interesting is the Bible talks about it so much, and yet we don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And there's probably some reasons for that, but that's another podcast.
Yeah, well, it was last week's podcast. Mm-hmm. Go listen to that one. Well, we talk about it a lot here on the Grow podcast, and it's why you named this the Grow podcast.
Right.
But God always has a next step for us. We say it all the time here on the podcast, but growth always starts with a next step. Mm-hmm. And so there's always a next step for us. Whether you're Pastor Mike and you've been a pastor for between
years.
60 and 70 years, somewhere around there. Oh, 30
sure,
years.
Sure,
yeah.
Cut that in half.
Michael, our producer, paid me to say 60 to 70 there, so I had to get it in. But so you've been a pastor for 30 years. Myself, you grew up in a Christian home, or maybe you're just exploring who God is and trying to figure out what it means to follow Christ. God has a next step for you at any point in your faith, and so that we're going to kind of talk about that this week as well.
It's probably my favorite
and how God
subject to talk about, and I wanted to tie up this whole weekend series with this because really it's been talking about the journeys of Abraham and the journey of our relationship with God.
Yeah.
And wrestling with that question, okay, if God has a next step for us, how do I recognize it? How does God really grow us? And I love talking about this. And I've spent probably the last, even longer than I've been a pastor, probably 33, 34 years reading and studying this. And this, my favorite thing, authors. And I actually in my notes have a whole list of authors that I go back to frequently. Guys like Dallas Willard, Richard and his son Nathan Foster have written some phenomenal books. A friend of mine, Kevin Myers, wrote a book called Home Run Life on this. John Ortberg, a friend of mine, Mike Hilson, and another David Canaan. David Canaan just wrote a book and is starting a podcast called Off the Fence. Ooh. And it's a great book and really I think will challenge you. And of course, then speakers and teachers from today like Andy Stanley. And all of these kind of come together for what we're going to hopefully tie up this whole series we've been in here to begin 2022 with.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the things God uses to grow us today. And, you just mentioned a bunch of different authors and speakers and teachers. So these are things that you find pretty consistent from their teachings, from Scripture as the primary source, but even from all these brilliant teachers and scholars, these are pretty consistent.
There's 5 things that are it's pretty much consensus among those that have really studied spiritual formation, which is God taking us next steps, that God uses almost 5 tools. God uses to grow us, and some of them, as we walk through them, you probably go, "Oh yeah, I get that." And there's some of them we go, "Oh yeah, that's it," and we think it as the only one.
Sure.
When in reality, if we approach it wrong, it will actually cause more damage. It's just like any tool. You can use it the wrong way, and it will mess you up instead of help you grow.
I wouldn't know about the
tools.
proper way to use
tools.
We teased you about not knowing sports. I'm going to go ahead and admit that tools are not my forte.
I've been over to your house to help fix a few things here and there.
Yes. So. I have a couple tools, okay? All right. Well, let's jump in. Which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, let's talk about one that we've talked about a lot in this series: experiences or circumstances. Because as we study Abraham's life in this series, we find God invited him to follow him to a promised land. It was 700 miles to the borders of Iraq, another 700 miles probably to the borders of the Promised Land, and then 800 miles wandering, another 800 miles down to Egypt, another 800 miles. In the weekend, I had people do the math because I couldn't do it that fast. But it's years of learning to follow God. God gave him, allowed him circumstances. And we call the circumstances, the Bible calls circumstances that God uses most to create us, to help us grow, trials. Now,
Why?
trials are different than temptations. God doesn't tempt us, and the book of James makes that very clear. A temptation is something that will tempt you to turn your back upon God. A trial is something that God allows to stretch you. Stretch you. Doesn't mean it's easy.
Sure.
It doesn't mean it's easy. 1 Peter 1:7 says that these trials are only to test your faith, to show that it's strong and pure. The Bible teaches in a few different places. It uses, like, take us back to high school chemistry, like the crucible.
Oh, goody.
Yeah, the crucible that, will burn things away and keep what's pure in there. And says God will allow some experiences and things to strengthen us and to burn stuff away that is getting in the way. And there's really three big trials that God allows, what I would call pressures, people, and persistence. We talked about all three of those this last weekend. What all three of those are. The pressures, things that we just feel like, oh, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know how to deal with that. Sometimes God will leave us in those. People.
Why would he leave us in a place where we feel overwhelmed?
Think about the fact, all right, we always have a basketball analogy, right? So, coach.
We do.
Do your players grow best by taking them out to McDonald's every week or having them run drills?
Definitely not McDonald's.
Yeah. And is running drills fun?
They
can be.
Yeah. But conditioning, I think, that's not very fun. Depends on the drill.
Yeah.
We have one called X-Outs, which is about the least enjoyable activity I've ever participated in. So now as a coach, I make my players do it.
Of course you do. Of course you do. But even there, I mean, part of that is your perspective. It's like, all right, I'm going to be sore afterwards. I'm going to be tired afterwards. But you know what? I'm going to be better on the other side of it. And that's how I think God will allow some of those things. We're tired. We're sore. Maybe we kind of want to give up. But if we press through the pressure, it actually grows us. Mm-hmm. The same thing is true. God will allow some people in our lives. And we read that like in the Apostle Paul's life. There were people that were around him. He's like, what am I going to do with this? And some of them he confronted, some were there. Scholars wonder when the Apostle Paul talked about God allowing a thorn in his flesh, it was obviously some kind of experience there. Yeah. And in fact, we're going to talk about in the next weekend series about contentment and how sometimes how we misunderstand contentment. And sometimes God will say yes to things that don't make us happy, but they help us grow. And back to our basketball analogy, but translate that to your life. The times in your life when you've grown the most are when? Are they the times when everything is hunky-dory? That's it. Is that an 80s term, by the way?
Well, we talked earlier about how long you've been a pastor. Yeah. I don't even know if back then hunky-dory was the go-to phrase.
When everything is, flowers and frills and fun.
No, definitely not.
Normally it's when things are tough.
Yep.
So pressures, people, things that we have to push through, persistence. Rick Warren actually suggests a fourth one. And of course, it's another P because he's a pastor. It's priorities. Sometimes God will allow things that will have us make a choice of what's important, and we experience the results. Neither one will destroy us, but we learn. It's kind of like as a parent, there are times and we're parenting adult children right now, which seems like every phase of parenting is harder than the last one. That's just my perspective. I'm just here to encourage
Thanks for the
parents.
Encouragement. My producer and I and our young children are very excited.
I always thought
the future.
Once they get out of the home, it's going to be great, but now you have no authority. And you have to watch them learn some painful lessons.
I'm
and
confident
making those choices.
That my parents would disagree and say that I've only become easier and easier to parent.
I'm friends with your dad. We will.
Maybe let's not ask him.
Yeah.
Let's not ask him.
So the big lesson here is pay attention to circumstances. There are some things that certainly are temptations, but there are some things that God will allow to stretch you.
How do I then potentially differentiate between the two, when, especially with that last one you said, where Rick Warren suggested, was it priorities? You said, where okay, we're going to learn from either making the right choice or the wrong choice. how do I differentiate between like, okay, this is a temptation, and if I make the wrong choice here, like it's more significant, as opposed to a priority where if I, and similarly to people who say, well, I'll never know if it's the wrong choice or what the results are so I need to make wrong choices so that I can experience what that is, so I can know that I want to make good
let's
choices.
go back to the parenting analogy. There are some choices that are out of rebellion. And there are some choices that are learning what's better and what's best. We can go back to our, basketball analogy. As a coach, you're saying, don't shoot the ball there, and they have to learn. Now, the other way, is it awful? Is it horrible? Well, it's not the best choice. Mm-hmm. But they've got to make some of those mistakes. And there's a difference between a mistake, and some of this goes back to the definition of sin. So scholars may argue with me on this one. There's a difference between a mistake and rebellion. Sure. And dismissing God's leadership. And there are times when God, I think, wants us to learn and will invite us to learn through some of the pain and some of the circumstances and choices. So that's the first one.
That's the first one. Let's go to the second.
Second one is probably the first thing that everybody thinks of in how God grows us. And that's teaching. And for good reason. What was the primary tool that Jesus used, that at least that we read about, to help people grow? It was his teaching. He was always teaching, always telling stories, and teaching is at the center of growth. And I've been in some discussions lately where people have said, you know what, I think the age of the sermon, the teaching in our worship experience, I think it's kind of gone away, and we need to go, with more short-term kinds of things and go away with that. The problem is, any church in history over the last 2,000 years that's gone away from teaching has actually gone away from truth. Teaching has to be at the center. That's one of the things I think was incredible that came out of the Protestant Reformation. Before that, the Lord's Supper, the altar, and again, I'm going to get myself in trouble with some scholars, was at the center of things. I think when you look at Jesus' teaching, yes, his sacrifice is at the center of things, but for the church, teaching was to be at the center. So we moved what used to be kind of the podium, the place where teaching is in the Protestant Reformation, we moved it back to the center. Now, we don't have those big podiums and desks and things to speak.
We can get you one if you want one.
But I think symbolically, teaching has got to be at the center. And Jesus modeled this.
Yeah.
His greatest sermon, Sermon on the Mount, you can read in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He ends with this great story. In children's church growing up, we used to sing the song about, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. Did you have that song growing up? Yeah. All right.
I choose to not sing on the Grow podcast because I respect all of you who are watching and listening.
And I'm not going to sing it either. And the wise man built his house upon the rock. And it talks about, what are you building your life on? But here's the key that we kind of miss in that, is it also talks about not just hearing it, but putting it in the practice. The wise man is the one who put the teaching into practice. Yeah. James talks about it later.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite verses.
Yeah. And can you quote it?
Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself, but do what it says.
Yeah. Right. And he goes on and he uses do you remember?
No.
What he says? You can summarize it.
You go for
Basically, it. Basically, looking at the word and walking away and forgetting what it says is like looking in a mirror and walking away and forgetting what you look like, which are some days I forget.
That's kind of a positive for me when that happens often, but I understand what he's saying.
But teaching is important, but teaching cannot be about information. Information by itself is not transformational. In fact, information by itself will turn into legalism, or it will load you down. And we all know people who are just so full of information, and they're constantly spouting that information off, correcting things and that. But then you look at their lives and how they live, and you're like, you're going, it never made it from here to here.
Yeah.
Never made it from here to here.
Which is what we see so much in the New Testament with the teachers of the law and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where they were so learned in the scriptures.
Exactly. They could quote, and some people can quote thousands of scriptures, but they miss applying it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why Paul is such a obviously he wrote most of the New Testament, so that's also an important reason. but the example of his life for us, even though we don't see a ton of him before he comes to know Christ, but we see him as Saul, where he had all of the knowledge and all of the understanding and all of the learning, but it wasn't until his the road to Damascus and that moment where he meets Jesus and he realizes I have to practice. Like, it's not like I've learned the wrong things, it's that I've chosen to not actually apply them to my life. And that, because I know for me, especially when I was in college and for a while I was studying Bible and theology, and that was a struggle for me. Like, I like knowledge. That's just, I like learning.
And there's nothing wrong with it.
No, not inherently. But when that becomes the priority over actually trying to apply the things that I'm learning to my life, that becomes a problem, especially a pride problem for a lot of us.
And here's what I want to do, and I didn't do it the first time, so I want to back up a little bit. With each one of these, I want to give us a little, because growth is always about a next step, right? So we're talking about growth.
I've heard people say that before.
I want to give us a little bit of a how-to. Here's how to make sure that this will help you grow. So like with circumstances, with experiences, the key here, and Colossians chapter 3 talks about this, basically says everything you do it as if you're representing the Lord. So when you're in difficult circumstances, make a choice to view it as an assignment. When you view it as an assignment, doesn't mean you don't ask God to get you out of it.
Sure.
Paul certainly did. Jesus did. And we'll talk about that on the weekend here in a couple of weeks. Jesus wanted to get out of it. But when both Paul and Jesus heard from God, no, you're in these circumstances, both went, all right, this is my assignment. And my assignment is to represent God. With teaching, the one thing I want us to do is make sure we're practicing hearing teaching and then coming out of it with what's one thing that I can do to put this into practice. And here's the big mistake. The big mistake a lot of times we do is one of two things. Either we fill our heads up with information, which we already talked about, but the other big mistake we make is we come out of it and we say, here's what I'm going to do, and it's this. We do this at the beginning of the year. We make like monster, big, hairy New Year's resolutions, and we fail by January 15th.
Yeah.
One of the keys, I just heard this on an incredible podcast from Craig Rochelle the other day. Start small, smaller than you think. Here's my one action step coming out of this, because you can do it. You can do it. So maybe like during this series, we talked about growing your relationship with the Lord. Start a daily time with God. Yeah. Set a timer for 5 minutes. You say, but maybe I should be 30. Start at 5 minutes, because you can do 5 minutes. Maybe 3 minutes, whatever that might be. And so with teaching, part of it is have an action step, because you've got to remember how many of us, they actually did a survey on this. So I'm going to have you guess the percentage. And it's not in the notes, so you can't cheat. What percentage of people they surveyed after lunch on Sunday remember what the teaching was about in church?
Producer, what do you think? Producer thinks 5%. I'm gonna go 34%. It's my favorite number, and I was thinking about a third.
24% remembered. But
how long of a lunch are we talking? Was it a buffet?
Yeah.
Was it
less than 10% could do more? Only less than 10% could do more than just give you one thing, that like one word that it was about.
Yeah. Wow.
Now here's the sad thing.
How's it make you feel as a
They surveyed the pastors who taught 24 hours later, and 30% of them couldn't remember what they taught. There's a problem, because that just is about information.
Yeah.
So part of this is have that action step. But Henry Blackaby said this years ago, if God says something to you that strikes you that you need to remember, write it down somewhere.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you need to be a huge note taker. Write it down somewhere. Keep a piece of paper in the back of your Bible, or pull out your phone and use the notes app, whatever, but write it down. So,
okay, I'm going to call an audible because we're almost we're right about how long we normally go for a podcast, and we've got 3 more things that God uses to grow. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna end this episode here, but we're just gonna keep our conversation going. So we'll do, I don't know, we'll put it out in the middle of the week or something like that, a second one, because I don't want to put out a really long podcast that people don't want to listen to. So we'll put out an extra episode to finish this conversation. Pastor Mike and I are just going to stay here and finish this conversation next. So make sure you join us. I don't know, let's say just in a couple days. We'll put it out in the middle of the week. And I don't even need to ask you about homework, because each one of these has already had its homework. So we're going to do that. We'll wrap this one up. Jump back in the next episode. I don't know if it'll be episode 32 or 31 and a half. We'll figure that out.
31 part 2?
Yeah.
How does that work? 31.5?
Thank you so much for joining us for the Grow podcast. We really love this chance we have to experience this teaching from Pastor Mike kind of in a conversational setting. And we know a lot of you have as well. So make sure you like and subscribe so you get notified when the new episodes come up. We really appreciate that you're here. Remember, growth always starts with the next step. So let's make sure we work on those next steps for our experiences/circumstances and teaching. And we'll cover the other 3 ways in that special episode we're going to have next. So thank you, Pastor Mike. Thank all of you for joining us. We'll see you next time.